All right. I hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to the last lecture of the semester. I feel like the last few weeks has really flown by for me quite a bit. So hopefully you've enjoyed the class, even with the craziness that has been this semester. I really do hope you've gotten something out of it. So today we're going to focus on kind of a review and a summary of the class, as well as looking towards the future, as far as the future of conservation science and policy. So let me share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint. So like I said, today is kind of a summary and then also looking towards the future. So today what I really want to talk about is go back to the beginning of the class when we talked about science-based conservation policy. I'm going to review that a little bit because the course is conservation science and policy. So that's obviously a major theme that's run throughout the semester. I do want to talk some about coronavirus or COVID-19 because there are a lot of similarities between science-based decision-making that we see in conservation and science-based decision-making that we've all seen dictate our lives over the last 2 months, and then end by looking towards the future. So just a few reminders. Discussion Leader 8 is today, so I'm going to keep this lecture a bit shorter also, so you have plenty of time to do that. Please comment by tomorrow at 2 p.m. And then discussion leaders have until May 11th at 2 p.m. to turn in their assignments. The online final, as I mentioned last time, will be available from May 7th to May 14th at 12 p.m. or noon. The earlier you do it, the earlier I will get it graded, and the earlier you will know your final grade in the class. Also, the earlier you'll be done. So if that's a motivation for you, hopefully it is. So some of the learning objectives describe the importance of science-based decision-making and some of the barriers, and then discuss the future of conservation science and policy. So fairly broad objectives for today. So this is where we started the class. This disconnect between the scientist you have on the right and the decision maker that you have on the left. And kind of at looking at a lot of the different policies and science that we've looked at over the course of the semester, the goal has been to learn about the science and the policy aspects, obviously, but also how they are connected and how they need to be connected in order to really be effective at conserving our natural resources. So this is from the very second lecture. We read that article by Game et al. And they defined policy relevant conservation science as, this was on the exam, so I think all of you know this pretty well, on the midterm, as science with a clearly articulated and substantive link to conservation outcomes through a policy process. And I still really like this graphic at the bottom because it really explains how to have science-based, evidence-informed policy as far as the scientific process, which you can see here in the scientific pipeline, and then having that information flow down to the actual decision makers who can then base their decisions, at least somewhat, on what the scientific evidence is saying. So what policy relevant conservation science might seek to do, and we've talked about a lot of these throughout the course of the semester. So raise awareness about problems with an existing policy or management practice. This can be seen in the article that we read looking at bear hunting, a lot of the wolf stuff actually, about how policy into hunting those animals or the management of those animals is maybe not scientifically sound. And oftentimes the actual sustainable number that you would need is much higher as far as the number of animals in the ecosystem that's needed to maintain that kind of ecosystem balance and problems with those existing policies. Obviously, climate change is a big one with this as well. And science has and is continuing to raise awareness about how our existing policies, surrounding greenhouse gas emissions and infrastructure and energy and all those things, how they are problematic if we want to actually mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions. So the second item is identifying management options that can drive policy prescriptions. There's a lot of different things we talked about here. Protected areas would be one big thing as far as looking at how different types of protected area management can inform policy decisions on what should be actually done in an area to conserve a species effectively. And all that, all the research that's done on biodiversity and ecosystem services can help to inform what kind of policy solutions can help to conserve ecosystem services and to conserve wildlife and to conserve biodiversity. That's a major role that science has to play. Third, make predictions about likely policy and management outcomes. So once a policy has been put into place, what does that mean? This is really, really talked about in a lot of different things that we talked about. Ecotourism perhaps is one example as far as looking at different ecotourism practices and different management policies and looking at how effective those might be at actually helping to conserve resources and work with local communities. And these are just some examples I'm giving. You can obviously apply a lot of these to a lot of things we've talked about. Address monitoring and evaluation to determine whether a policy has been successful. Citizen science can help do this. A lot of the lion guardians example, I talked about it in Kenya, you can monitor lion populations and see if the lion guardians management model and policy has actually been effective at conserving lions. That's one example there. And then number 5, identify new policy options. So this is, particularly when you're thinking about innovations and new technologies, some of the smart cities and some of the initiatives, urban planning things, the science behind that can really help identify new ideas that can contribute towards conservation and contribute towards creating policy that will help promote conservation outcomes. So we went through this list at the beginning of the semester, but I'm hoping now that we've gone through this wide variety of topics that, really the role of science in informing policy is really a bit more concrete, and that you have all these examples at your fingertips for how and why science can and should inform conservation policy. So another thing we spent a lot of time about is talking about conservation more generally. So obviously, science contributes significantly to conservation efforts, and policy contributes significantly to conservation efforts, and they should overlap. The other thing that I very purposely spent a lot of time in the beginning of the class talking about is values, because this is something that's often honestly left out of the conversation. People don't talk about values enough. So I'm hoping that that piece of this class was particularly new and valuable for you to think about, as far as, I had you think about how your own values influence your, ideas about science and policy and how conservation should take place. We spent time looking at religion and the role religion and those values can play in conservation. So those kind of things are really important to not leave out. Values inform science and what we conduct research on, and they also inform policy. So really it's these 3 things that I know the title of the class leaves this values part out, but it really shouldn't be. It really should be conservation, science, policy, and values, because all of those 3 things are incredibly important, as I'm sure by this point in class you've realized. So the reading for today was really aiming to look at some of the challenges for why science does not often enough inform policy, and really kind of move past the why and move towards the how can we improve this. So this is, I just want to kind of highlight some of the major pieces from the reading today. I know this will be talked about more in the discussion leader discussions, but a few things I really wanted to highlight was this first thing. So the authors identify the top 3 barriers for the use of science in conservation policy, and then some of the solutions that have been proposed to deal with these barriers. So the first is that conservation is often not a political priority. You could argue that this is slowly changing, I think. But some of the solutions that have been shown to work are public science outreach, more long-term policy-making bodies. It's hard to make these long-term conservation objectives a priority when political leaders are changing every few years. And then demonstrate benefits of conservation, which is hard once again when you have such turnover when it comes to political ideas, not only with politicians, but also in the general public. But these are some of the solutions that are meant to address that conservation is not a political priority and to make it a political priority. Number 2 is that there is poor engagement between scientists and decision makers, which is what that kind of comic at the very beginning of this lecture showed. And some of the solutions that have been shown to work include more collaboration in project design and policy making, and the use of knowledge brokers. So a knowledge broker is someone who's in between. They're not the scientist and they're not the decision maker, but they're someone who can effectively communicate science to the decision maker. So they're the bridge, they're the go-between between scientists and decision makers, who often maybe don't understand each other or are just not in the same room ever to have these conversations. Number 3, that conservation problems are complex and uncertain, which we've definitely talked about plenty in this class. Some of the kind of shown and proven solutions to this barrier is to train scientists in science communication, so that scientists know how to speak, using simple words and in a way that's understandable to the general public and not just to their fellow scientists. And then encourage transdisciplinary research. So that's research that is not just in one field or one discipline, but perhaps you have a project and you have scientists from geography and anthropology and biology and public affairs, and they're all working on the same project together. So they can each bring their own area of expertise, which can help kind of unravel some of this complexity and some of this uncertainty. So I guess the problem is, and what they really talk about in the article is that these barriers and these solutions are nothing new. These are things that we've known for a long time, and I'm sure we've talked about a lot of this in class. So if we know the barriers and we know the solutions, why is this still not working? Why are there problems? They have this figure in their paper, which I really liked. So they kind of walk through the stages. So you have, on top, you have A, where the barriers causing this are unknown. So we don't know the barriers to why science is not informing policy, which we're past that. We're past stage A. B, where the barriers have been identified, but there's no solutions. So we know the barriers, but we don't yet know the solutions. We're also already past that. C is when we know the barriers, there are identified solutions, but there are still challenges. That key cannot fit in the door. It's kind of what that picture is trying to show. So they're talking about how there's implementation challenges. So that's basically where the authors argue is where we really need to get to step D. So I have a blown up picture of that on the next page, and they really talk about how the real problem is not looking at what barriers exist or what solutions there are, but really about implementing these solutions, which, we've also talked about in class. For example, if you have, say, on paper, a protected area, sure, you've identified a challenge, you've created a policy to conserve that area, but if you don't implement that, those policies, you don't implement that protected area to be managed in a certain way, then it's kind of useless. So I really like this figure because it really, neatly explains like, okay, now the solutions have been effectively implemented. So it's really this implementation stage, which is really the reason in a lot of issues that exist why, science and evidence do not necessarily inform policy, because implementing those solutions is incredibly, can be incredibly complicated and kind of goes against how systems are set up right now. So they talk about this a bit more. They talk about, there's I think 4 different ones. So implementation challenges. We talk about existing governance practices, norms, and voting behavior. So some of this is, like I said before, it's hard to implement any kind of long-term dialogue or collaboration when politicians are changing constantly, practices are changing, or maybe they're not changing is also the problem. It really depends on what it is. Voting behavior, often people vote based on a single issue. There's a lot of implementation challenges there. I said the lack of institutional arrangements for collaboration. You can say, hey, politicians, you should go collaborate with the scientists, but if there's not an actual formal arrangement for doing that, if there's not, someone's job who is to do that, then it often won't get done. And the same is true with scientists. You have these amazing scientists working in universities, and they're busy teaching and researching and doing all these other things, and they may not make it a priority. They may not make the time to go out and work with policymakers. And often maybe that's not their fault, because most academics and scientists, they're not really, those kind of activities, they don't really receive a lot of credit for. You're judged based on your research and based on your teaching. You're not necessarily judged based on your outreach and how you influence policy as an academic. So that's an institutional problem as far as promoting collaboration. The third one is the practical challenges, and this is not so different. These are all overlapping, obviously. Practical challenges of co-production and transdisciplinarity. So actually co-creating knowledge and co-creating science, so you have the scientists and the decision makers working together, can be really difficult for a lot of reasons. One is mutual trust. Scientists might not trust politicians and vice versa. And then long-term commitment. This takes researchers and politicians or decision makers to be committed to working together for years and years and years. And that's often difficult to do for a wide variety of reasons. And then the last one is a limited career opportunities for these knowledge brokers, so the go-between people. This is really talking about how it's not good enough to just train scientists to communicate science and to be engaged with communities and outreach. You really do need skilled people who can be the go-between between research and policy. And there are honestly not a lot of jobs. There's not a lot of jobs in this field. There are organizations where their goal is to communicate science. You could say a lot of journalists also kind of fill this role to some extent, but it's not, the fact that I can't even think of that many job titles off the top of my head that do this means that there really aren't a lot of jobs. And that's a big problem, because it's hard to implement a lot of these strategies when there's not that person or that organization that can very easily link scientists with policymakers. So that is kind of the summary of where we've kind of the overarching theme of the course, I guess, as far as conservation, science, and policy, and how the article assigned for today looks at kind of how to move beyond where we are, as far as we know the barriers, we know the solutions. Now it's really about implementation. And I think this really resonates with COVID-19 or coronavirus. I don't know about you all, but whenever I've been watching the news the last 2 months or so, you hear politicians actually talk quite a bit about using science-based decision, using evidence-based decisions to make their choices about stay-at-home orders and all of these policies that have been severely impacting our lives. Whenever I hear that, I can't stop thinking about our class, to be honest, because this is a really kind of very salient example of the interplay of science and policy that is much more vivid, and I said much more impactful to our lives right now than most people think of conservation science and policy. So I just pulled a few headlines from the last few days, just to kind of highlight how some people are, how science has been used and how some people say that science should be used more when looking at how to reopen the country, when looking at how to do testing and all of these things. So like I said, science has really informed all these things we've been talking about a lot recently. How social distancing and staying at home can help, reduce the spread of the virus. That's all based on science. Wearing masks, that's kind of flip-flopped a bit as far as saying you don't need to wear a mask. The science says don't, to actually the science says yes. Washing hands, obviously, testing, antibody testings, vaccines, treatments, these are all based on science. And the policies around these things are sometimes have been based on science and sometimes haven't, as far as, rumors about different treatments that can actually help treat coronavirus. Some of that's been based on science and some of that has not, that you've heard in the news. Stay-at-home orders, once again, some of it based on science, some of it not. So I just really, I don't know, I just, when I have been seeing the news a lot looking at COVID-19, I really think about the role that science has played in the policies that are currently regulating our lives. And I do really hope that science, and I do think that science has played a large role, and I hope that it continues to play a large role as, people, including myself, are starting to get antsy and wanting to, live our lives at least somewhat how we used to. I really do hope that we can continue to let science lead. However, that's becoming less, not less common, but there's still opposition to using science, right? So science versus politics. Here's just one comic that I found online. But you have the coronavirus chasing President Trump. He says, "We've got this foreign virus hoax, the fake news and Democrats are all panicking about under control." So this is how, the politicians have played a huge role in creating policy for how we're dealing with coronavirus, some of them listening more to science than others, and that has dictated their policy-making decisions, and that's very, very obvious. So you still have, as you do in conservation, you have this science versus politics. You also have science versus economics, which is a major reason why people maybe are against some of the environmental acts and some of the environmental policies because they say it hurts the economy. This is actually the exact same when it comes to COVID-19. This is a graph from the US Department of Labor looking at unemployment. It's really hard to, argue with someone who doesn't have a job, is struggling with food insecurity, perhaps struggling with homelessness, that they need to just listen to science and just deal with it. That's not that we also can't do the same thing when it comes to conservation, right? You can't say, or it's very difficult in my opinion, to say to someone, you can't cut down that tree, even though you need it to feed your family and you need it to make a living. So these kind of same science versus economic decisions are happening today, which is one of the major reasons why there's been a recent push in the last few days to weeks to reopen the country, because of the economic side of things and how people are struggling. While a lot of that does go against what the science and what the medical experts are saying. So going back to the implementation, which was, move my head, this is the same implementation challenges that were mentioned in the reading for today. And I think a lot of these have been challenges as well for coronavirus, but I think some of them have also been moved beyond, and there actually have been implementations. So existing government practices and norms have changed a lot with coronavirus. And this is, I think, actually helped to implement some of the policies that have been implemented. Lack of institutional arrangements for collaboration. When it comes to a lot of these medical decisions, we've actually seen very obviously politicians talking to scientists and vice versa. So when it comes to the medical sphere, there actually seems to be some institutional arrangements for collaboration. Organizations within the national government, within the state government, that are meant to be there to inform politicians. So the practical challenges of co-production and transdisciplinarity. once again, I think that from COVID-19, there actually has been I think there has been knowledge that's created with both scientists and with policymakers as far as how do we test, how do we bend the curve or so forth. I think there has been folks that are collaborating and working together. And then limited career opportunities for knowledge brokers. Most of us are getting our knowledge from the news. So that's why the most kind of obvious example are a lot of these reporters. Some of them are trained to communicate science, and some of them are just reporters who do a lot of communication in general to the public. But there seems to be some evidence that there are people that are acting as go-betweens to try to communicate actual and accurate information to the public and to policymakers based on science. And I'm sure you guys can think of, other ways that COVID plays into these implementation challenge, either how they've been challenges still when it comes to dealing with COVID, or how we've actually gotten past some of these implementation challenges. Those are just a few thoughts from me. All right, so now I'm going to pivot towards the future. So obviously knowing where we've come from as far as this science and conservation and how they play off each other is really important and also what's going on now. But what does the future look like? Don't know if I have one answer for that, but I'm going to talk about a few things here. So first, I want you to watch this video. Just keep moving my head out of the way. Called Our Future by Morgan Freeman. It's on YouTube. I think that Morgan Freeman is maybe the second best narrator of nature films after Sir, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name. You know who I'm talking about. Sorry, sorry about that. Total brain fart. But this video is really great because it really talks about the future of conservation and how we can get there. And I wanted to include a kind of a bigger, broader, inspirational video like this because it's only 4 minutes, because that's how we started class too. The first day of class, I showed a video about our planet and the need for conservation. So I'm hoping that this can kind of take a lot of the, I guess what I called in the beginning, the doom and gloom of some of the topics that we've talked about, how, especially the climate change lecture, I apologize about that, how we were talking a lot about a lot of the issues, but how there really are still a lot of very tangible solutions to these issues. So please go ahead and pause this lecture and go watch Morgan Freeman's video. All right, welcome back. So I really like this video because he really tries to be realistic while also being optimistic, which can sometimes be very challenging. And what it really comes down to is that he's trying to make the point that it's all about the choices that we make and that individuals do matter and our individual choices do matter. He talks about the daily choices that we make. We can choose to be optimistic. Career choices, honestly, I haven't mentioned that so much, but that's important as well. What you choose to do with 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for the rest of your life, not to sound scary, can really make an impact. Honestly, for myself, I wanted to be a professor because while I really enjoy doing all the field work and all the conservation work that I've done, when I think about it, I think I can make a bigger impact, honestly, by teaching and by conducting research. So myself, I am one person, but even if, 1/10 of my students go on to careers that can help environmental conservation, and I've, contributed to them making that choice in some way or another, then that's a bigger impact than I would have had anyway. Sorry for being a little cheesy there, but that's career choices that you make can also matter quite a bit. Also, lifestyle choices. This means a lot of different things as far as how you eat, how you live, what kinds of energy that you use, transportation options. These are very, very tangible individual things and individual choices we can make. So it helps when you're feeling maybe overwhelmed by some of the environmental issues. Just think about, what can I do today? What are these little choices that I can make? And it's also important to acknowledge that for a lot of us in this class and a lot of us in the United States, we actually have the freedom to make choices, which is not the case for many people in the United States and around the world who are really more on survival mode. Not saying that folks who are on survival mode can't make sustainable choices. That's obviously not true. But if you don't have to worry about where your food comes from, if you know you'll have a place to live, then you have more freedom in your life to make choices about what you do and how you live. So just want to recognize this kind of privilege that a lot of us do have as far as being able to actually make choices when some people are unable to. So as you probably realize by now, there's no one answer for conservation issues. There's no panacea. What I really instead want to think about as far as like, oh, what's the one thing we can do as a world to solve these problems? I really want to think about and have you think about it more as a toolbox. So for example, the hammer is the IPCC and the wrench is ecotourism and the screwdriver is community-based conservation. All these different tools are available to conservationists and policymakers. And it's really about finding the right tool for the right job. So I really have hoped that we've covered quite a bit of different tools, if that even makes sense, that the different topics we've covered in this class have really kind of expanded your own toolbox as well, as far as different ideas you have about how to solve a lot of these major conservation issues, and particularly what kind of tools might help solve what issues. I also really want to encourage you, because it is so easy to get overwhelmed, to think about just you. What can you do? What about our individual actions? Because that's the one thing that we all are responsible for. I can't control what other people do, but I can control what I do. And particularly I can control what I do locally. So thinking globally, and this is obviously a really overused term, this think globally, act locally, but I think that it is overused so much because it is so effective, to be honest, and really quite accurate. So think about all the, global issues and context, but then how can you use all that information to act the best that you can locally? Not saying that one of you can change the whole world, but one of you can change your own actions, right? So that's kind of, I guess, what I would just really encourage you to think about quite a bit. This kind of goes with the same thing, like, can I, one person, really make a difference? And the answer is obviously yes, you can. You can make a difference locally at a small scale, and that's fine. Because if everyone does that, it can make a big difference. Which, once again, I know this is a bit more on the cheesy side, I guess, but I think that it's 100% true. If there's enough people that are making small changes, then it does make a big difference. One little action that you do or commit to can really help, cascade things down and make a big difference. So I encourage you, like I said before, to really just think about what small things you can do and go from there. That's a really good way to not get overwhelmed when it comes to conservation and sustainability, or really anything else in life, right? Start with the small and then work your way up from there. And that's how you can actually feel like you're moving forward and actually are moving forward instead of just becoming overwhelmed and being stagnant. So with that, as I said, I was going to keep today's lecture a bit short. And I hope that, some of these takeaways from today are, once again, like not necessarily new, but I just want to really reiterate this, because we focused a lot on this class on some of these bigger picture policies and conservation initiatives. It's also important to think of how you as an individual can contribute to those. So to end today's lecture, the last lecture, the same as always, go to Blackboard, click on May 6th participation, the future, and go ahead and answer the prompt. And the prompt for today is really kind of following the last few slides of the lecture. I really want you to think about what you want to do in the future and how you want to make a pledge to your future self for, what steps you're going to make in your own life as far as contributing to conservation, science, and policy. So that's all written up on Blackboard. Go ahead and look at that. I want to say it's been a pleasure Let me stop sharing my screen. It's been a pleasure throughout this semester, and I wish that we had more time in person. Sorry, had more time in person together, but at least we had half the semester before going to this weird online format. And I hope the transition was as easy as possible for you all. I tried to make it as easy as possible and as fair as possible while still, making sure this class had some content to it and that you were still learning things and learning skills. So hopefully I was relatively successful at that. You be the judge. And please do, stay in touch. I know most of you are juniors, so if you're around next year, I'd love to see you and chat with you again. And hopefully we will be in person. So with that, take care. Don't forget to take the final. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at any time. All right, bye.